They refused the cowboy a drink because they thought a thirsty man had no power left. By sundown, the whole town would learn how wrong they were. The heat over Black Hollow shimmered like fire above iron rails. Dust rolled slow across the empty street while tired horses stood tied beneath crooked awnings, their sides twitching against flies. It was the kind of afternoon that made decent men quiet and cruel men louder. Inside the Silver Lantern Saloon, whiskey glasses clinked beneath lazy piano notes while ranch hands crowded around card tables thick with cigar smoke. Nobody noticed the rider at first. He came in without hurry, pushing through the swinging doors with the slow movement of a man who had spent too many miles beneath too much sun. Dust covered every inch of him. His boots were gray from trail dirt. His black hat hung low enough to shadow his eyes, but not enough to hide the exhaustion carved into his face. The room fell silent anyway. Maybe it was the way he carried himself. Maybe it was because truly tired men bring a strange kind of stillness into a room. The cowboy stepped toward the bar, each spur clicking softly against old wood floorboards. "Just water," he said quietly. His voice sounded dry enough to crack. Cliff Dugan looked up from polishing a glass. The saloon owner was a thick man with slick hair and a smile that never reached his eyes. He studied the stranger for a long moment while several men nearby exchanged smirks. "Water?" Cliff asked. "That all?" The cowboy nodded once. "Been riding near 40 miles since sunrise." Someone chuckled from the poker table. Another man leaned back in his chair and muttered, "Looks like the desert already drank half of him." Laughter spread low through the room. The cowboy never reacted. He just rested one weathered hand against the counter while sunlight poured through the saloon windows behind him, wrapping his silhouette in gold dust and shadow. Then his eyes drifted upward. They stopped on an old silver cup sitting alone behind the bar. The expression on his face changed so slightly most people missed it. Not surprise. Not fear. Something quieter than that. Like memory walking through a graveyard. Cliff noticed. "You like that cup?" he asked. The cowboy looked at him. "Where'd you get it?" Cliff shrugged. "Been here longer than I have." One of the ranch hands laughed. "Careful, Cliff. Maybe he plans on stealing it." More laughter followed. The cowboy ignored them. Outside, wind scraped dust along the boardwalk. Somewhere down the street, a loose shutter knocked against a wall in slow rhythm. Cliff reached for the silver cup at last. The room watched with growing amusement while he carried it toward a barrel near the back wall. Cool water splashed softly into the cup. Tiny droplets rolled down the silver sides, catching the sunlight. For one brief second, the cowboy's eyes stayed fixed on that water like it meant more than gold. Cliff walked back slowly, letting anticipation build inside the saloon. Then, standing inches away from the exhausted rider, he tilted the cup sideways. Water spilled onto the wooden floor between the cowboy's boots. The room erupted with laughter so loud the piano player stopped entirely. "There you go," Cliff said with a grin. "Floor's still wet if you're desperate enough." One man slapped the table hard enough to shake his cards. Another leaned over and pointed at the puddle spreading across the floorboards. "Hell," he barked, "that's probably the cleanest bath he's had all month." The cowboy looked down at the spilled water. Then slowly back up at Cliff Dugan. No anger touched his face. That was the unsettling part. Men in Black Hollow understood shouting. They understood fists and threats and whiskey rage. But silence like this felt heavier somehow. Sheriff Owen Hale sat near the far wall with half a drink in his hand. He had watched everything without speaking. His jaw tightened slightly now, though he still didn't move. The cowboy glanced toward him only once. That single look carried enough disappointment to make the sheriff lower his eyes. "You too tired to kneel?" one ranch hand called out. "Might earn yourself another sip." The laughter returned harder this time. The cowboy rested both hands against the counter and lowered his head for a moment. Several people thought he might actually kneel. Instead, he spoke softly. Enough that everyone leaned closer to hear him. My father taught me something about water. The room quieted again. What's that? Cliff asked. The cowboy lifted his eyes toward the silver cup still hanging loosely in Cliff's hand. A thirsty man remembers who denied it. The word settled across the saloon like distant thunder. Nobody laughed this time. The cowboy reached into his coat pocket, laid 2 silver coins onto the counter untouched, then turned toward the doors. His boots echoed across the floor while sunlight swallowed him whole again. Outside, his horse waited motionless beside the hitching rail. The rider climbed into the saddle without another word and disappeared slowly into the burning afternoon haze. For several seconds, nobody inside the silver lantern spoke at all. Then Cliff snorted and tossed the silver cup carelessly back behind the bar. Damn drifter, he muttered. But old Martha Bennett, sitting alone near the window with her knitting untouched in her lap, stared out toward the empty road with pale eyes full of something colder than fear. Because she had recognized the cowboy the moment he looked at that silver cup. And deep down, she suspected Black Hollow had just insulted the wrong man. The silence inside the silver lantern did not last long after the cowboy disappeared down the road. Men like Cliff Dugan could not survive in frontier towns without learning how to laugh at uneasy feelings before they turned into fear. Within minutes the card game started again. Chairs scraped across the floorboards. Whiskey bottles clinked beneath the yellow glow of kerosene lamps while somebody at the piano forced cheerful notes back into the room. But the laughter sounded thinner now. Less certain. Sheriff Owen Hale noticed it immediately. He sat near the back wall turning his glass slowly between rough fingers while his eyes drifted toward the saloon windows every few seconds. Dust still floated outside where the rider had vanished into the heat. You look nervous, Sheriff, Cliff called from behind the bar. What happened? That drifter cast some kind of spell on you. Several men laughed again. Owen ignored them. You know who that was, he asked quietly. Cliff snorted. Just another thirsty cowboy too broke to buy whiskey. But old Martha Bennett stood up from her corner table before the sheriff could answer. Her knitting needles rested forgotten beside an untouched cup of coffee gone cold hours ago. At nearly 70 years old, Martha had lived in Black Hollow longer than anyone still breathing. She remembered when the streets were mud instead of packed dirt. She remembered when there had only been 3 buildings standing beneath the desert wind. And she remembered the Mercer family. That was Silas Mercer, she said softly. The piano stopped again. Cliff frowned. Mercer. Martha nodded once toward the silver cup behind the bar. His father owned that cup. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Outside, the wind carried a loose swirl of sand through the street while a horse somewhere down the block stamped impatiently against dry earth. Cliff forced out a laugh. Elias Mercer has been dead near 20 years. That does not change whose son walked through your door, Martha replied. Sheriff Hale slowly set down his glass. I heard stories, he admitted. Thought they were exaggerated. Martha looked toward the dusty windows again. They were not. One of the younger ranch hands leaned back in his chair. Who cares if his daddy dug a few wells? Martha turned toward him with tired eyes sharp as old nails. That man nearly died building this town water line through solid rock while your father was still learning how to shave. The room quieted again. Most of the younger men had never heard much about Elias Mercer. Frontier towns forgot people quickly. Especially good men. But the older faces inside the saloon remembered. They remembered a broad-shouldered rancher hauling barrels of water through drought seasons while other men guarded their supplies with shotguns and chains. They remembered a man who never turned away strangers no matter how poor or filthy they looked. Elias used to leave water buckets outside his ranch every summer, Martha continued softly. Said no traveler should fear dying thirsty. Cliff rolled his eyes, though his grin looked weaker now. Well, his son sure survived. Disappointment easy enough. Nobody answered him this time. Sheriff Hale stood slowly from his chair and walked toward the saloon doors. Where are you going? Cliff asked. Owen rested one hand against the frame while sunlight burned across his badge. Just checking something. The sheriff stepped outside into heat thick enough to shimmer above the road. Black Hollow looked ordinary at first glance. Horses tied outside the general store. Laundry moving gently in the dry breeze. A pair of boys chasing each other between wagon wheels. But then Owen noticed something strange near the horizon west of town. Dust. A great deal of it. Not drifting wind dust. Moving dust. The sheriff narrowed his eyes beneath the afternoon glare. Long trails of brown cloud stretched low against the desert floor nearly 3 miles out. Too large for a single rider. Too steady for weather. Behind him the saloon doors creaked open. Cliff stepped outside, wiping his hands on a rag. What now? Owen pointed silently toward the horizon. Cliff squinted into the sunlight. Probably cattle. But even as he said it, his voice lost confidence. The dust line kept growing. Wider. Heavier. Like the desert itself was beginning to move. Martha appeared behind them next, one weathered hand gripping the doorway. The old woman looked west only once before her face drained pale beneath the afternoon light. Lord have mercy, she whispered. Sheriff Hale swallowed hard. Because he could hear it now beneath the wind. Low and distant. The sound of thousands of hooves rolling slowly across open land like approaching thunder. And somewhere far beyond that growing wall of dust rode the thirsty cowboy they had laughed out of town only 2 hours earlier. The sound reached Black Hollow long before the cattle did. Deep. Slow. Endless. Like the earth itself had grown a heartbeat beneath the desert floor. Sheriff Owen Hale stood in the middle of the street with one hand resting against his belt while townspeople slowly emerged from shops and boarding houses around him. Doors opened carefully. Curtains shifted. Even the horses tied outside the feed store seemed restless now, their ears twitching toward the western horizon where the dust cloud continued to grow larger beneath the burning afternoon sun. That is too many head for a local drive, Owen muttered quietly. Cliff Dugan stepped off the saloon porch beside him, though the confidence from earlier had faded from his face. Maybe they are heading north, he said. Maybe they are just passing through. Martha Bennett shook her head before the sheriff could answer. No cattle drive passes Black Hollow by accident. The old woman clutched her shawl tighter around narrow shoulders while dry wind stirred silver strands of hair loose around her face. Not with water this scarce for 40 miles. More people gathered in the street now. Shopkeepers. Stable boys. Ranch hands. Children too young to understand why grown men suddenly looked nervous. The low thunder of hooves rolled louder across the valley while dust climbed higher into the sky. Then someone near the general store whispered, "Dear God," shapes finally emerged from the haze. Hundreds of longhorn cattle stretched across the desert like a moving river of horns and muscle. Their hides flashed beneath sunlight while riders drifted along both sides of the herd, calm and disciplined beneath wide-brimmed hats coated gray with trail dust. There were more cowboys than anyone in town had expected. 40 at least. Maybe 50. Every saddle carried the same burned symbol. A circle crossed by a single line through the center. Sheriff Hale felt his stomach tighten the moment he recognized it. The Mercer brand. Cliff noticed his expression immediately. What? He asked. Owen never looked away from the approaching riders. That brand runs cattle from Texas all the way to Montana. So whoever controls that drive controls nearly every beef contract north of the Arizona Territory this season. Cliff swallowed once. Around them the street had gone nearly silent except for distant hooves and dry wind rattling loose signs overhead. The cattle slowed as they approached Black Hollow. Riders guided the massive herd with quiet whistles and patient movements while dust rolled around them in thick golden waves. Then the lead rider finally appeared through the haze. Silas Mercer. He rode at the front beneath the fading afternoon light, calm as stone, one hand resting loose against the saddle horn. The same dusty black hat shadowed his eyes. The same weathered coat hung across broad shoulders burned hard by years beneath desert suns. But now he no longer looked like a tired drifter wandering through town alone. Now he looked exactly what he truly was. A man other men followed without question. Several riders near the front nodded toward him constantly, waiting for signals so small most people would never notice them. Respect moved around Silas Mercer like invisible gravity. Cliff Dugan suddenly shifted uncomfortably beside the sheriff. "He is doing this on purpose," he muttered. "No," Owen replied quietly. "That is what scares me." The cattle drive reached the edge of town at last. Every merchant in Black Hollow understood what should happen next. The cowboys would stable horses, buy whiskey, rent rooms, fill the saloon with noise and silver dollars all night long. One cattle drive like this could keep a frontier town alive for months. Cliff knew it too. That was why sweat had begun forming along his temples despite the dry desert heat. Silas Mercer slowed his horse near the center of town. For one long moment his eyes drifted toward the Silver Lantern Saloon where men still stood frozen on the porch watching him. The entire street seemed to stop breathing. Cliff forced himself forward one step and attempted a smile that looked painfully weak. "Mr. Mercer," he called out loudly. "Looks like you brought business with you after all." Silas studied him without expression. Then his gaze moved slowly across Black Hollow itself. The feed store. The hotel. The water tower his father had once helped build with bare hands and borrowed tools. Finally his eyes settled briefly on Sheriff Hale. The sheriff felt shame crawl through his chest all over again. Silas never mentioned the spilled water. Never mentioned the laughter. He simply lifted one hand slightly toward the riders behind him. That tiny gesture changed everything. The entire cattle drive turned east. Not toward town. Away from it. Hundreds of longhorn cattle shifted direction together. Beneath clouds of dust while riders guided them calmly toward the open valley leading to Dry Creek Junction nearly 15 miles away. A murmur spread across Black Hollow immediately. Confused. Uneasy. Cliff stepped forward fast enough to stumble off the boardwalk. "Wait," he shouted. "You are passing us by." Silas Mercer finally answered him. "Seems there are towns that still remember what water is for." Then he touched his boots lightly against the horse's sides and rode onward with the entire cattle drive following behind him like a moving storm. By the time the dust settled an hour later, the street outside the Silver Lantern Saloon felt emptier than any graveyard Sheriff Hale had ever seen. Frontier towns do not die all at once. First the music stops. Then the laughter grows nervous. Then men begin counting how much they stand to lose. By nightfall, Black Hollow had reached the counting stage. The sun dipped low behind the desert ridges, staining the horizon red while long shadows stretched across empty streets that should have been alive with cattle money and whiskey noise. Normally a drive that size would have packed every business in town before dark. Stable boys would have worked until midnight brushing down horses. The hotel would have charged double for rooms and still run out of beds. The Silver Lantern Saloon should have been drowning in smoke, cards, and loud songs by now. Instead only 6 customers sat inside. Even the piano player had gone home early. Cliff Dugan stood behind the bar wiping the same glass over and over while silence settled heavy across the room like desert dust. Every few seconds he glanced toward the doors as if expecting them to swing open anyway. But they never did. Dry Creek Junction had taken the cattle drive instead. And everyone in Black Hollow knew exactly why. Sheriff Owen Hale sat alone near the window watching twilight deepen outside. He had removed his badge hours ago and laid it beside his untouched drink. "You should say something," Martha Bennett muttered quietly from her table in the corner. Owen looked at her tired face across the dim saloon light. "About what?" "About today." The sheriff rubbed one hand slowly across his jaw. Would it matter now? Martha did not answer immediately. Outside, wind rolled through town carrying faint distant sounds from the valley east of Black Hollow. Music. Laughter. Horses. Dry Creek Junction celebrating the Mercer Drive. Every sound felt like salt rubbed into an open wound. Cliff slammed the glass down harder than he intended. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "One cowboy cannot ruin an entire town because somebody bruised his pride." Martha looked up sharply. "It was not pride." Cliff scoffed. "Then what was it?" The old woman leaned back slowly in her chair, her pale eyes reflecting the weak glow of lantern light. "His father spent half his life making sure thirsty people survived this desert." Her voice stayed calm, but every word landed heavy. "And today this town mocked his son for asking the same kindness." Nobody replied. Because nobody could deny it. Sheriff Hale stared out the window toward the dark street while memory slowly crawled back through his mind. He remembered being 14 years old during the drought of '72. Wells drying up. Livestock collapsing in fields beneath brutal heat. Families leaving town with everything they owned tied behind wagons because there was simply no water left. Then Elias Mercer arrived hauling barrels across 40 miles of desert twice a week with bleeding hands and exhausted horses. Owen remembered his own mother crying after Mercer filled their empty water trough without charging a single penny. Back then Black Hollow had called Elias Mercer a hero. Funny how quickly towns forget the men who save them once the danger passes. "You know the worst part?" Martha asked softly. Cliff frowned. "What?" "Silas never threatened anybody." The saloon owner looked away. Because she was right. The cowboy had not shouted. Had not reached for his gun. Had not demanded revenge or respect. He had simply left. And somehow that felt far heavier now than anger would have. The saloon doors creaked open suddenly beneath a gust of cool night air. Everyone looked up at once. A young stable boy stepped inside breathing hard from running. "Sheriff," he said quickly. "You better come see this." Owen stood. Immediately. Outside, darkness had settled fully across Black Hollow except for lanterns glowing weakly along the boardwalks. The stable boy pointed east toward the distant valley beyond town. Far away against the black desert night flickered dozens of campfires spread across the open land like scattered stars. The Mercer camp. Even from nearly 15 miles away the glow seemed alive. Warm. Prosperous. Full of movement and voices carried faintly by the wind. Sheriff Hale could almost smell coffee and cattle smoke drifting across the desert. Behind him Cliff stared silently at those distant fires while realization slowly settled across his face. Every one of those flames represented money his saloon would never see. Meals never served. Rooms never rented. Barrels never emptied. And all because one exhausted cowboy had walked through his doors asking for water. "It is only one cattle drive," Cliff muttered finally, though his voice lacked conviction now. Martha stepped onto the boardwalk beside them, wrapping her shawl tighter against the cool desert wind. "No," she whispered while staring at the distant fires. "It is a message." The sheriff swallowed quietly. Because deep down he understood something Cliff still refused to face. Men like Silas Mercer did not need revenge. The frontier itself listened when they chose to walk away. Morning arrived without the usual sounds of Black Hollow waking to business. No wagon deliveries rattled down Main Street before sunrise. No ranch hands crowded the bakery for coffee and biscuits. Even the horses seemed quieter somehow, standing beneath pale dawn light while cool desert wine drifted through nearly empty roads. Sheriff Owen Hale noticed it the moment he stepped outside his office. Frontier towns lived on movement. On noise. On men spending money faster than they earned it. But Black Hollow felt frozen now, like a place holding its breath after bad news nobody wanted to say out loud. Across the street, the feed store owner stood leaning against his doorway staring at a nearly untouched stack of hay bundles that should have sold the night before. 2 hotels still had dark windows because no travelers had rented rooms. And inside the Silver Lantern Saloon, Cliff Dugan sat alone behind the counter counting bottles instead of customers. The sheriff walked slowly down the boardwalk while sunlight crept across weathered buildings 1 inch at a time. He found Martha Bennett sweeping dust outside the church steps. "Town feels different," Owen muttered. Martha nodded without looking up. People finally realized kindness is worth more than whiskey. The sheriff gave a tired sigh. "You think one missed cattle drive can hurt us that badly?" Martha stopped sweeping then. She rested both hands on the broom handle and looked toward the eastern valley where faint smoke from the Mercer camp still rose into the sky 15 miles away. "It is not one drive," she said quietly. "It is what follows." Owen frowned slightly. Before she could explain, hoofbeats echoed suddenly through the street. Fast. Urgent. A rider appeared from the southern road covered in trail dust, his horse lathered with sweat from hard riding. The man pulled sharply to a stop near the sheriff's office and dismounted before the horse fully settled. "You Owen Hale?" he asked quickly. "Depends who is asking." "Name is Walter Pierce. I run supply contracts for the Arizona Beef Trail." That caught the sheriff's attention immediately. Walter removed his hat, wiping sweat from his brow while several townspeople nearby slowly turned to listen. "I came ahead from Dry Creek Junction," Walter explained. "Mercer signed a full-season agreement with them last night." Cliff Dugan stepped out of the saloon the moment he heard that. "Full season?" Walter nodded once. "Every cattle drive under Mercer contracts will bypass Black Hollow from now on." Silence rolled across the street heavier than thunder. Cliff laughed nervously. "That is impossible." Walter looked at him carefully. "You own the saloon?" "Yeah." "Then I suggest you start saving money." Even the wind seemed to stop moving for a second. Walter continued before anyone could speak. "Mercer runs nearly 30,000 head north every year. Other outfits follow his routes because his drives are safe and his crews are respected. If he avoids your town, most others will too." Cliff's face slowly drained pale beneath the morning sun. "Over spilled water?" Walter studied him quietly. "No," he glanced toward the distant desert horizon. "Over what the spilled water revealed." The word settled hard into the silence. Nearby, shopkeepers exchanged uneasy looks. Everyone in Black Hollow understood numbers. 30,000 cattle meant freight contracts. Railroad deals. Supply wagons. Hotels. Feed. Whiskey. Work. Without those drives, businesses would slowly choke beneath dust and unpaid debts. Sheriff Hale felt cold settle deep in his stomach despite the growing heat. "You saying Mercer planned this?" Walter shook his head immediately. "Men like Silas Mercer do not waste time planning revenge." He gave a faint smile filled more with respect than humor. "They simply remember who they can trust." Cliff leaned heavily against the saloon porch railing now. "This town has been here 30 years. Then maybe it forgot what built it," Walter answered quietly. He climbed back into the saddle afterward without another word and rode north through town while people watched him disappear beneath rising desert heat. Nobody moved for several seconds after he left. Then slowly, almost carefully, folks began drifting back toward empty businesses and silent storefronts. Like mourners leaving a graveside. Sheriff Hale remained standing in the middle of Main Street staring east where smoke from the Mercer camp still climbed peacefully into the morning sky. Martha stepped beside him again at last. "Elias Mercer once told me something during the drought," she said softly. Owen glanced at her. "What was that?" The old woman looked toward the water tower standing tall above Black Hollow. "He said a town is measured by how it treats thirsty people." The sheriff lowered his eyes slowly. Because for the first time in many years, he realized Black Hollow might not survive the measure. By the third day, people in Black Hollow stopped pretending nothing had changed. Empty chairs inside the Silver Lantern remained empty. The hotel owner began lowering room prices by half just to attract passing travelers. Feed sacks gathered dust in storage sheds while stable boys sat outside. Whittling wood because there were no horses left to tend. The town had not collapsed yet. Frontier places rarely did. They simply grew quieter one painful inch at a time. Sheriff Owen Hale noticed another change too. Folks had started speaking softer whenever they passed the saloon. Like guilt itself had settled over Main Street. That afternoon, heat rolled heavy across town while Owen sat outside his office cleaning dust from his old Winchester with slow careful motions. He had not slept much since the Mercer drive bypassed Black Hollow. Every time he closed his eyes he saw water spilling across saloon floorboards while tired men laughed at someone asking for mercy no greater than a drink. The sound of wagon wheels pulled him from his thoughts. An old freight wagon creaked slowly into town carrying barrels strapped beneath faded canvas. Two mules dragged it forward through the heat while the driver hummed quietly beneath a weather-beaten hat. Owen recognized him immediately. Jeremiah Cole. One of the oldest freight haulers left in the territory. Jeremiah stopped near the sheriff's office and climbed stiffly down from the wagon seat. "Afternoon, Owen." "Jeremiah." The old driver wiped sweat from his neck and looked around the strangely silent town. "Feels different here." Owen gave a tired smile. "Everybody keeps saying that." Jeremiah's eyes drifted toward the saloon across the street. "I heard what happened." The sheriff lowered his rifle slowly. "News travels fast." "Not as fast as respect," Jeremiah answered quietly. That sentence hung between them a long moment while dry wind pushed dust along the boardwalks. Finally Owen asked, "You know Silas Mercer well?" Jeremiah chuckled softly beneath his gray beard. "Longer than you have worn that badge." He walked toward one of the barrels on his wagon and rested a hand against the wood. "You know what these are?" "Water barrels." Jeremiah nodded once. "Silas paid for them himself during the drought down near Mesa Ridge last summer." Owen frowned slightly. "Mesa Ridge?" 3 children nearly died when their well collapsed. Jeremiah's eyes stayed fixed on the barrel. Silas rode 40 miles through desert heat, hauling water before sunrise every morning for nearly 2 weeks. The sheriff said nothing. Jeremiah continued quietly. "Never told anybody either. Folks only found out because one of the children wrote him a thank you letter." Wind rattled a loose sign somewhere farther down Main Street. Owen stared across town toward the Silver Lantern while something heavy settled deeper in his chest. Jeremiah looked at him carefully. "You want to know why men follow Silas Mercer?" The sheriff nodded faintly. "Because he remembers what suffering feels like." Jeremiah climbed slowly onto the wagon wheel and loosened one of the barrel lids. Cool water sloshed softly inside. After Elias Mercer died, Silas spent years riding cattle trails alone. Sometimes 50 miles between wells. Sometimes more. The old freight driver smiled faintly. "He once told me thirsty men become honest because pain strips away everything false." Owen swallowed quietly. Across the street, Cliff Dugan stepped outside the saloon carrying empty crates. He noticed Jeremiah immediately and forced a grin onto his face. "Well now," Cliff called loudly. "At least somebody still does business here." Jeremiah studied him silently for a moment before answering. Not for long if your town keeps forgetting decency. Cliff's smile disappeared. Everybody acts like we robbed the man. Jeremiah climbed down from the wagon slowly. His old boots hit the dirt with a dull heavy sound. No, he said calmly. You robbed yourselves. Cliff opened his mouth to respond but no words came out. Because deep down he knew the old driver was right. Jeremiah reached into the wagon afterward and pulled out a small object wrapped carefully in cloth. He handed it to Sheriff Hale without explanation. Owen unfolded the fabric slowly. Inside rested an old photograph faded nearly white from age. A younger Elias Mercer stood beside the first well Black Hollow had ever built. Beside him stood townspeople smiling proudly beneath fresh lumber and bright desert sun. Owen recognized several faces instantly. Martha Bennett as a young woman. The feed store owner's father. Even Cliff Dugan's grandfather standing near the back row with one hand resting on Elias Mercer's shoulder. At the center of the photograph sat the same silver cup from the saloon. Jeremiah pointed toward it quietly. That cup was a gift from the whole town after the well opened. The sheriff looked up slowly. You are kidding. No, Jeremiah's expression hardened beneath the afternoon light. Your town handed that family a silver cup for bringing water to the desert. He glanced toward the saloon doors across the street. Then years later used it to humiliate the sun. Nobody spoke after that. Even Cliff Dugan stood motionless beside the porch, staring at the old photograph while sunlight faded slowly across Black Hollow like something sacred leaving for good. Night settled over Black Hollow like a slow funeral blanket. Lanterns glowed weakly behind dusty windows while desert wine drifted through nearly empty streets carrying the faint smell of sagebrush and dry earth. The Silver Lantern Saloon still stood open, but the place no longer sounded like itself. No piano music floated into the street. No loud card games rattled the tables. Only the soft clink of glasses and quiet voices remained, as if the whole town had suddenly become afraid of speaking too loudly. Cliff Dugan stood behind the bar staring at the silver cup resting alone near the back shelf. He had moved it 3 times already that evening. First beneath the counter. Then inside a cabinet. Then back into plain sight again. Somehow hiding it felt worse. The cup seemed to watch him now beneath the lantern glow, polished silver reflecting flickers of light across the empty room. Sheriff Owen Hale sat near the front window while rainless thunder rolled faintly across distant desert hills. Not storm thunder. Hooves again. More cattle moving somewhere far east near Dry Creek Junction. Business that belonged to Black Hollow once. Cliff poured whiskey into a glass without asking if Owen wanted any. You think he planned all this? He asked quietly after several minutes. Owen looked toward him slowly. No, then why does it feel like punishment? The sheriff rested both hands around his untouched drink. Because shame usually does. Cliff gave a bitter laugh at that. Funny. Thing is, I have thrown out drunk men, thieves, gamblers, even a few killers over the years. His eyes drifted back toward the silver cup again. But I cannot stop thinking about one thirsty cowboy. Nobody spoke after that. Outside, boardwalks creaked beneath cool desert wind while a loose shutter knocked somewhere down the street in slow uneven rhythm. Then suddenly footsteps approached the saloon doors. Slow. Heavy. Several heads turned at once. An old rancher stepped inside carrying dust across the floorboards with every step. He wore a faded brown coat and a cattleman hat stained dark with sweat rings from years beneath open sky. Cliff recognized him immediately. Amos Ridley. One of the largest ranch owners north of the Arizona line. Evening, Amos muttered quietly. Ridley, Cliff replied. What brings you here? Amos removed his gloves slowly but never sat down. Passing through. The old rancher's eyes drifted around the nearly empty saloon before settling on the sheriff. Heard Mercer took his drives east. Owen nodded once. Seems that way. Amos grunted softly. Then others will too. Cliff stiffened behind the counter. What is that supposed to mean? Amos looked at him calmly. Means cattlemen watch each other. He stepped closer toward the bar. Men trust Mercer because he keeps his word and treats people fair. The rancher glanced around the silent saloon again. And now folks are wondering what kind of town mocks a thirsty traveler. Cliff opened his mouth but Amos raised one rough hand slightly. You do not understand yet, he said quietly. This is not about business anymore. Those words seemed to drain the remaining warmth from the room. Amos finally lowered himself onto a stool near the counter. 30 years ago, he continued softly, I nearly lost my wife crossing this desert. Sheriff Hale looked up immediately because he had never heard Amos Ridley speak about his family. Wagon wheel broke near Dead Horse Ridge during August heat. Amos stared at the whiskey glass in front of him though he never touched it. No water left. Horses dying. My wife fainted before noon. The saloon remained silent enough to hear lantern flames flicker. Then Elias Mercer found us. Amos smiled faintly at the memory. Man gave us every drop he carried even though he still had 20 miles left to ride himself. Cliff swallowed quietly. Amos looked toward the silver cup on the shelf behind the bar. That family built its name carrying water through hard country. His voice lowered even further. Now people are saying Black Hollow forgot how to be human. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed loudly. Because deep down every soul inside the saloon understood the truth of it. Amos finally stood again and placed $2 silver onto the counter untouched. Keep the whiskey, he said calmly. I just came to see whether the stories were true. Cliff frowned faintly. And? Amos pulled his gloves back on slowly. Stories usually get exaggerated. He looked once more at the silver cup before turning toward the doors. This one did not. The rancher disappeared into the night afterward, leaving only cold wind drifting through the saloon entrance behind him. Sheriff Hale stared at the untouched silver dollars resting on the counter for a long moment. Then quietly, almost to himself, he spoke words that settled heavy over the empty room. A town can survive drought. His tired eyes lifted toward the silver cup glowing beneath lantern light. But I do not think it survives losing its soul. Some men lose sleep because they fear danger. Others lose sleep because they finally understand what they have become. Cliff Dugan sat alone inside the silver lantern long after midnight with only one lantern still burning above the bar. The rest of Black Hollow had gone dark hours ago. Outside, desert wind whispered through empty streets while distant coyotes called somewhere beyond the hills. But Cliff could not stop staring at the silver cup resting in front of him. He had polished it twice already. That somehow made things worse. Every scratch across the old silver carried history now. Elias Mercer's hands had touched this cup. The town had once lifted it high in celebration. And Cliff had used it to humiliate the man's son over a drink of water. He rubbed one hand slowly across his face. For the first time in many years, the saloon owner looked tired instead of hard. Truly tired. The kind of exhaustion that settles inside a man when pride finally begins cracking apart. The saloon doors creaked softly behind him. Sheriff Owen Hale stepped inside without speaking. He removed his hat slowly and sat near the end of the counter. Neither man talked for nearly a minute. Only lantern flames moved between them. Finally Cliff broke the silence. You ever think a town can apologize? Owen studied the weary face across from him. Depends if the town means it. Cliff let out a bitter laugh beneath his breath. I poured whiskey for thieves and gamblers half my life. His eyes drifted toward the silver cup again. But somehow denying water feels uglier. The sheriff nodded quietly. Because water is different out here. Cliff swallowed once. He knew that already. Everybody raised in desert country knew it before they learned arithmetic. Water was survival. Mercy. Respect. Frontier men could refuse favors. Refuse money. Refuse friendship. But refusing water carried something colder inside it. Something permanent. Cliff stood slowly from behind the bar and reached for the silver cup with both hands. "I am going east," he said quietly. Owen looked up immediately. "Tonight? Before I lose my nerve." The sheriff studied him for a long moment before finally standing to. "Then I am coming with you." An hour later 2 horses moved through the moonlit desert beneath cold silver light. Sand shifted softly beneath hooves while distant campfires flickered low against the eastern valley. The Mercer camp. From far away it looked almost peaceful. Wagons arranged carefully in a wide circle. Horses tied near feed lines. Men sitting beside fires drinking coffee after long trail days. No shouting. No drunken singing. Just quiet order beneath open stars. Cliff slowed his horse as they approached the outer edge of camp. Several cowboys noticed them immediately. Hands rested near holsters out of habit, though nobody drew a weapon. One rider stepped forward from the shadows. "Evening," he called calmly. Sheriff Hale lifted one hand. "We are here to speak with Silas Mercer." The rider studied both men briefly before nodding. Toward the largest fire near the center of camp. "He is there." Cliff's stomach tightened harder with every step his horse carried him forward. He had faced angry drunks, armed outlaws, even railroad men during land disputes over the years without fear touching him once. But tonight his chest felt heavy enough to crack ribs. Silas Mercer sat beside the fire pouring coffee into a tin cup when they approached. Firelight flickered across his weathered face while several riders nearby quietly stepped away to give space. The cowboy looked up once as Cliff and Owen dismounted. No anger appeared in his expression. That somehow made things harder. Cliff removed his hat slowly. Wind stirred across the dark valley carrying scents of smoke, leather, and cattle. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then Cliff finally stepped forward holding the silver cup carefully in both hands. "This belongs to your family," he said quietly. Silas looked down at the cup resting beneath firelight. His eyes lingered on it for a long moment. "Used to belong to the town too," he answered softly. Cliff lowered his gaze. "Not lately." The fire cracked between them. Somewhere farther out in camp a horse snorted softly against the cold night air. Sheriff Hale stood silently nearby while shame and desert wind moved together through the darkness. Cliff swallowed hard before speaking again. "I came to apologize." Silas Mercer leaned back slightly beside the fire, studying the tired saloon owner in silence. "For the water?" he asked quietly. Cliff shook his head once. "For forgetting what it meant." Those words hung still beneath the stars. No man around the fire moved. Finally Silas reached out and accepted the silver cup from Cliff's hands. He turned it slowly beneath the firelight, thumb brushing old scratches worn smooth by time and memory. Then the cowboy looked up at last. "My father used to say water shows a man's true nature faster than gold ever could." Cliff closed his eyes briefly. Because deep down he knew Black Hollow had shown exactly what kind of town it had become. The desert grows cold before dawn in ways that surprise people who have never slept beneath open sky. Wind moves sharper. Campfires burn lower. And men who carry regrets tend to feel them more deeply in those final quiet hours before sunrise. Cliff Dugan sat beside the dying fire across from Silas Mercer with both hands wrapped around untouched coffee. Sheriff Owen Hale stood nearby staring east where pale gray light slowly crept across the horizon. Around them the Mercer camp remained calm and disciplined even before morning fully arrived. Cowboys moved quietly between horses and wagons. Coffee boiled over low flames. Saddles creaked softly beneath cold wind. Nobody laughed loudly. Nobody bragged. It felt less like an outlaw camp and more like a traveling family built from hard miles and mutual respect. Cliff noticed that more than anything. Men greeted Silas with nods instead of fear. That kind of loyalty could not be bought with money. It had to be earned over years beneath sun and dust and suffering. Silas still held the silver cup near the firelight, turning it slowly in weathered hands. Finally he spoke without looking up. When I was 10 years old, my father brought me to Black Hollow after the new well opened. Cliff listened quietly. Town held a celebration. A faint smile touched Silas's face for the first time since they arrived. People lined the streets. Women baked pies. Men shook my father's hand until midnight. The cowboy's thumb brushed the edge of the silver cup gently. One old rancher told me water was the closest thing the desert had to kindness. Wind drifted softly through camp carrying smoke and distant cattle sounds beneath fading stars. Silas looked toward the dark valley where Black Hollow still slept 15 miles away. Funny thing about towns, he said quietly. They do not notice when kindness starts disappearing. Cliff lowered his eyes. He wanted to defend himself somehow. To explain years of hard business and rough people and the kind of survival frontier life demanded. But excuses sounded small now. Too small. Because deep down he knew the truth. Somewhere along the way he had stopped seeing thirsty travelers as human beings and started seeing them as burdens. Sheriff Hale finally stepped closer to the fire. What happens now? Silas looked at him calmly. Morning comes. And after that? The cowboy studied the sheriff for a long moment before answering. That depends what kind of town Black Hollow wants to become. Silence settled over the camp again. Then unexpectedly, Silas stood and walked toward one of the supply wagons nearby. He returned carrying 2 wooden water barrels bound tightly with iron rings. These were heading north with us, he said. Cliff frowned faintly. Why are you showing us this? Silas rested one hand against the barrels. Dry weather coming next month. Wells around your south ridge will not hold. Sheriff Hale blinked in surprise. How do you know that? A faint tired smile crossed Silas's face. Same way my father knew. He looked toward the eastern hills where dawn light slowly painted the desert gold. Men who ride long enough learn to read thirsty land. Cliff stared at the barrels speechless. After everything that happened, after all the humiliation and loss, the cowboy was still thinking about whether Black Hollow would have enough water. That realization struck harder than any anger could have. Silas stepped toward him then and placed the silver cup carefully into Cliff's hands. Keep it in the saloon, he said quietly. Cliff looked up in confusion. After what I did. Especially after what you did. Firelight flickered softly across Silas Mercer's face while the first sunlight touched the valley beyond camp. People need reminders when they start forgetting who they are. Cliff gripped the silver cup tightly with both hands. For the first time in years his eyes looked uncertain instead of proud. I do not know if the town deserves this. Silas glanced toward the waking horizon. Maybe not. Then he reached down, lifted one of the water barrels with quiet strength, and rolled it toward Cliff's wagon. But thirsty people still deserve water. Nobody spoke after that. Because there was nothing left to say. As sunrise spread slowly across the desert, Sheriff Hale and Cliff Dugan rode back toward Black Hollow with 2 water barrels strapped behind them and the silver cup resting carefully between folded blankets. The town looked smaller somehow when they finally reached it. Quieter too. But when Cliff stepped back inside the silver lantern that morning, he placed the silver cup in the center of the bar where every traveler could see it. And beneath the cup he nailed a small wooden sign carved by his own trembling hands during the ride home. It read only 6 words. Water is free for every soul. Years later people would still speak about the season Black Hollow nearly lost itself over one drink of water. But older folks always told the story the same way in the end. Not as a tale about shame. Not as a tale about revenge. But as a reminder that out on the frontier, the strongest men were rarely the fastest with a gun. Usually they were the ones wise enough to carry water through the desert even after the desert had been cruel to them.